It was a Friday night at Brood Grounds, one of Portland's busiest coffee shops, and every table was full. The man sitting across from Olivia Brooks straightened his jacket, looked her dead in the eye, and said it loud enough for the nearest 3 tables to hear. "Honestly, marrying you would just be adding dead weight to my life." Then he stood up, buttoned his coat, and walked out without looking back, leaving her sitting alone in the middle of a room that had gone very, very quiet. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then a man at the next table slowly pushed back his chair, stood up, walked over, and pulled out the empty seat across from her. He looked at her and asked quietly, "Would it be all right if I sat here?" Olivia did not move right away. She kept her hands flat on the table, her coffee cup still full and untouched, and she looked at the man standing beside the empty chair as though she wasn't entirely sure he was real. Around her, the low hum of conversation had slowly started up again, the way it does after something uncomfortable. People returning to their own lives, their own drinks, their own carefully maintained sense of normalcy. But the warmth she had felt walking into Brood Grounds that evening was completely gone. The man who had just spoken to her was not Derek. Derek had already left. This was someone else, someone she had never seen before, someone who had apparently been sitting at the table beside hers long enough to witness everything. He was tall, with the kind of quiet build that came from actual work rather than a gym. His jacket was plain, his expression was calm, and he was not looking at her with pity. That more than anything was what made her pull her hands off the table and gesture toward the chair. "Sure," she said. It came out steadier than she expected. He sat down without ceremony. He didn't immediately say something comforting or clever. He just settled into the chair, glanced briefly at the door Derek had walked out of, and then looked back at her with an expression that asked nothing and offered nothing except presence. His name, he told her a moment later, was Liam Carter. Olivia Brooks had agreed to the blind date because her closest friend had asked her 3 times over the course of 6 weeks, and eventually it had felt less exhausting to say yes than to keep explaining why she wasn't interested. She had not expected much. After 2 serious relationships that had each ended with the same quiet erosion of trust, one man who had drifted away without explanation, another who had stayed too long and lied too smoothly, she had arrived at a place that was not quite cynicism and not quite peace. It was something more like vigilance. She paid her own bills, managed a team of 14 people at the furniture store, where she'd worked for 6 years, and had quietly taken over most of the financial responsibility for her mother, Margaret, who had been managing a chronic illness with the same stubborn dignity that Olivia had apparently inherited. Her life was structured and demanding and largely self-sufficient, and she had learned to take pride in that, even on the days when the weight of it pressed down harder than usual. Derek had been pleasant enough in the 10 minutes before everything collapsed. Then someone at a nearby table had recognized Olivia, a former co-worker who had stopped by briefly to say hello, and in the course of that brief exchange, the subject of her mother had come up. Not dramatically, not as a plea for sympathy, just a passing reference to the fact that Olivia had rearranged her schedule recently to help cover some medical appointments. That was all it took. Once the former co-worker moved on, Derek had leaned back in his chair, studied her for a moment, and said what he said. His tone was almost academic, as though he were identifying a flaw in a business proposal rather than speaking to a person. She had not cried. She had wanted to, but she hadn't. Liam, it turned out, had been sitting at the next table since before she arrived. He had been waiting for a contractor he worked with, who had canceled last minute and hadn't bothered to call ahead. He owned a small construction company, residential builds, mostly renovations in the older neighborhoods north of downtown, and the kind of day he'd had meant he had been glad for the excuse to sit somewhere quiet with a cup of coffee and not think for an hour. He hadn't been looking for anything. He hadn't been listening deliberately. He had simply been close enough that not hearing would have required actual effort. "You don't have to explain anything," he told her, When she started to say something about Derek, about the blind date, about how she normally wasn't someone this happened to. You really don't. She stopped, looked at him. Does that mean you heard all of it? Enough, he said. And enough to know it had nothing to do with you. It was not a groundbreaking thing to say. It was not a line that would appear in anyone's memory as particularly brilliant. But he said it without performance, without the particular energy of a man who wanted credit for being kind, and that was the thing that landed. Olivia wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and finally took a drink. They talked for almost 2 hours. It started carefully surface things, professional things, the kind of conversation that two people have when they are testing the temperature of each other's honesty. He told her about the company, about how he'd started it at 30 with 1 truck and 2 employees, and had spent the better part of 8 years building it into something that could survive a bad quarter. She told him about the store, about the particular skill required to manage people who were technically capable, but temperamentally difficult, about the satisfaction of watching a space transform from a showroom floor into something a family would actually live inside. They were both, it turned out, people who had learned to find meaning in work, because work, unlike almost everything else, gave back what you put in. At some point, the conversation shifted the way it does when two people stop performing and start simply talking. Liam mentioned his wife without planning to. Her name was Sarah, and she had died 3 years ago from an illness that had moved faster than anyone had prepared for. He said it plainly without drama, the way someone speaks about a wound that has fully scarred over, not because it no longer matters, but because they have made a kind of peace with carrying it. He said she had been the more social one, the one who filled every room with noise and plans and people, and that after she was gone, he had realized how much of his own life he had simply outsourced to her warmth. He hadn't known how to rebuild that on his own, so mostly he hadn't tried. Olivia did not offer him sympathy in the way most people do, the reflexive softening of the voice, the hand reaching across. She just listened, and when he finished, she said quietly, 3 years is not a very long time. No, he agreed. It isn't. She didn't tell him everything about her own history that night. She told him enough for him to understand that trust for her was not something that came free or fast, that she had built her life around the principle of not needing more than she could provide for herself, and that somewhere along the way, that principle had calcified into something lonelier than she had intended. She did not say that last part out loud, but the way she said the rest of it made the shape of it clear. When the coffee shop began stacking chairs at the far end of the room, the subtle signal that the evening was ending, they both noticed at the same time. Liam looked at his watch. Olivia looked at the door. There was a beat where neither of them acknowledged the obvious fact that neither of them had wanted to leave an hour ago, and neither of them particularly wanted to leave now. I didn't catch your name, he said, though she had told him at the start. She smiled for the first time all evening. You did, actually. Olivia, he said, and said it the way a person says a word they've been quietly repeating to themselves. Right. She gathered her coat and her bag, and he stood when she did not, because it was theatrical, but because it was the kind of thing he did without thinking about it. They walked out together and stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the cold November air. The street was quiet. The glow from the coffee shop window fell across the pavement in a long rectangle of yellow light, and somewhere down the block, a car passed and turned and was gone. Liam asked if she would be all right getting home. She said she would. He said he'd like to have coffee again sometime if she was open to it. Not a date. Just coffee. He made that distinction gently and clearly, and she understood what he was doing, giving her a door that had no pressure attached to it, no expectation built into the frame. Olivia thought about it for exactly 2 seconds. Okay, she said. Just coffee. They exchanged numbers on the sidewalk the way people do when the situation hasn't been romantic, but has been real in some other way that doesn't have a cleaner name. Then she walked to her car, and he walked to his truck, and neither of them looked back because neither of them needed to. Something had already shifted, not dramatically, not with fanfare, but in the particular quiet way that important things sometimes begin. What Liam did not say that night, and would not say for a long time, was that walking over to Olivia's table had been the first genuinely impulsive thing he had done in 3 years. Since Sarah died, his life had been organized around predictability. He worked his route, managed his crew, came home to the same house, in the same way, cooked the same handful of dinners, went to bed at the same hour. It was not an unhappy life. It was a contained one. And containment had been the point, not because he feared joy exactly, but because he had learned in the most brutal possible way that joy was not insured. That you could build something real and beautiful and then lose it entirely, and the only thing that survived was the shape of the absence. He had told himself in the years since that he was not lonely. He had told himself this often enough that it had become a kind of background noise, always running, rarely examined. But sitting across from Olivia that night, watching her gather herself back together with a kind of quiet, practiced dignity, he had felt something shift in him too. Not hope, exactly. Something more cautious than that. Something that felt like the first small crack in a wall he had not realized he was still building. He drove home through the lit streets of Portland and did not turn on the radio. He thought about what she had said about her mother, the matter-of-fact way she had described it, without asking for anything, without framing it as a tragedy or a burden, just a fact of her life that she was handling, because it was hers to handle. He thought about the steadiness in her voice, and the way she had looked at him when he said Sarah's name, not with discomfort, or with the performed sadness most people offered, but with something that felt like genuine recognition, like she understood in some specific and personal way what it meant to carry something you hadn't chosen. He didn't know yet what to do with any of that. He only knew that when he unlocked his front door and stepped into the quiet of his house, the silence felt different than it had that morning. Not heavier, just more apparent, more worth noticing. Olivia, for her part, sat in her parked car for several minutes before starting the engine. She had her phone in her hand, and she was aware that she should call her friend to report back on the disaster of the blind date. And she would, but not yet. Right now, she needed a moment that belonged only to herself. The evening had started badly enough that she had been prepared to go home and simply erase it, to file it under the long category of things she had tried that hadn't worked and was better off forgetting. Instead, it had ended with something she didn't have a word for yet. Not happiness. Not excitement. Something quieter. The faint, tentative sense that the night had not entirely been a loss. She thought about the way he had walked over without asking anyone's permission, and without performing it either. No announcements, no theatrical gesture, just a man who had decided that the right thing to do was simple, and had done it simply. She thought about how he had said, "It had nothing to do with you," and meant it. She thought about the conversation that had followed the 2 hours of it, and how she had said more to this stranger than she had said to most people she had known for years. That was the thing that stayed with her as she finally started the engine and pulled out into the dark street. Not the fact that he had been kind. She had met kind men before, and it had not always meant anything. What stayed was the quality of his attention, the way he had listened not to prepare a response, but simply to understand. She had not felt managed or handled or impressed. She had felt for the first time in longer than she could precisely name that someone was actually in the room with her. She drove home with the heater running and the city lights moving past the windows, and she did not let herself think too far ahead. She had learned the cost of that. But somewhere beneath the caution, beneath the practiced self-sufficiency and the years of careful distance, something small and stubborn had stirred the part of her that still believed, despite all available evidence, that there was a version of her life that held more than what she had settled for. That part of her was very quiet. But that night, for the first time in a long time, it was not entirely silent. The first coffee after that night was on a Tuesday morning before either of them started work. It was at a different place, a smaller shop 2 blocks from the furniture store, where Olivia worked, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu that never quite matched what was actually available. Liam arrived first and had already ordered by the time she walked in. He had gotten her a black coffee because that was what she had been drinking at Brood Grounds, and she noticed that he had paid attention to that detail without making anything of it. She sat down across from him, and they picked up the conversation almost exactly where they had left it, as though the week between had been a brief interruption rather than a gap. That became the pattern. Tuesday mornings, sometimes a Saturday afternoon, if the week allowed it. They talked about work, about the city, about the particular texture of lives that had been built carefully out of necessity. Liam told her about a renovation project in the Irvington neighborhood, a 1920s craftsman that the owners wanted modernized without losing the bones of the original structure, and she listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed she understood something about space and proportion and what it meant to preserve the character of a place while making it livable. Olivia told him about a difficult personnel situation at the store, a senior employee who was technically excellent, but had started quietly undermining the newer staff, and Liam listened without rushing to a solution, which was rarer than it should have been. Weeks passed. The coffee became dinners. The dinners became longer. Neither of them named what was happening because naming it felt like a way of making it fragile, and both of them had learned in their separate ways that fragile things broke. But it was there in the way he remembered small things she'd mentioned in passing and brought them up later, in the way she found herself saving observations throughout the week because she wanted to tell him specifically. Something was building between them carefully and without announcement, and they were both aware of it, and neither of them said so directly. The fear lived alongside it the entire time. Olivia knew her own patterns well enough to recognize what was happening inside her, the gradual construction of a wall that looked like openness, but was at its foundation a defense. Every time Liam said something that landed too accurately, every time she felt herself wanting to reach across and close the remaining distance, something older and more automatic pulled back. She had been here before. She had felt this particular warmth before and had watched it become something else. Indifference, then absence, then the slow realization that the person she had trusted had never quite seen her the way she thought they had. The experience had left a residue. Not bitterness, she was too practical for bitterness, but a vigilance she couldn't fully disable even when she wanted to. Liam carried his own version of it. His was less about betrayal and more about mathematics, the simple, brutal arithmetic of loss. He had loved someone completely, and she was gone. The love had not protected either of them, and the life he had built in the years since was a life deliberately scaled down. Not because he had given up on meaning, but because he had learned to distrust abundance, to keep things modest, to not need too much. Olivia, with her steady intelligence and her quiet self-sufficiency, and the particular way she looked at him when he said something honest, she was not modest. She was not something he could hold at a safe distance, and that scared him in a way he hadn't been scared in a long time. Still, they kept showing up. Tuesday mornings, Saturday afternoons. The gap between them closed slowly, the way a room warms not through any single moment, but through accumulation. It was in the middle of January when everything shifted. Olivia had been quieter than usual for about 2 weeks. Liam had noticed, but hadn't pushed understanding from everything he knew about her, that she processed things inward first and outward only when she was ready. Then one evening over dinner at a Thai place near her apartment, she told him, Her mother, Margaret, had been managing her illness for several years, with medication and careful monitoring, but the most recent round of tests had shown that the condition had progressed. The cardiologist had recommended surgery, a specific procedure that had a strong success rate, but carried a significant price. The number Olivia said quietly over her half-eaten plate of food was not a small one. It was the kind of number that rewrote a person's financial picture entirely. She said it without self-pity, without asking for anything, in exactly the same tone she used to discuss difficult situations at work. She was telling him because he was someone she trusted, not because she needed him to fix it. That distinction was important to her, and he could hear it in every word. She had already started looking at options: a payment plan with the hospital, a medical financing service, selling some of the furniture pieces she'd been collecting for years. She was not defeated. She was just carrying something very heavy and had decided for once to let someone see it. Liam listened to all of it. He did not offer money. He understood without being told that offering money would be the wrong move, that it would make her feel exactly the thing she was most afraid of feeling, which was dependent. Instead, he asked the right questions about the surgeon, about the hospital's financial assistance programs, about whether she'd spoken to a patient advocate yet. He had dealt with enough contractors and subcontractors and insurance adjusters to know how institutions worked, how to find the people inside them who actually had the authority to negotiate. He shared that knowledge practically and without condescension. Here are the doors that exist. Here is how you knock on them. By the end of the evening, she had 3 specific next steps she hadn't had before. He made clear, though, that this was information, not intervention. The doing was still hers, if she wanted it that way. She looked at him across the table, and something in her face was different, softer, but not weaker, more open than he had seen it. That was the evening Derek came back. Not that night, not literally. But within the week, Olivia's phone rang with a number she recognized, and when she picked up out of something between surprise and sheer curiosity, she heard his voice. Derek sounded different than he had at Brood Grounds. The arrogance was still there, but it had been smoothed over, coated in something that resembled sincerity. He said he had thought about what happened, that he had behaved badly, that he wanted to make it right. He said he had heard, through the mutual friend who had originally set up the blind date, that she was dealing with a difficult family situation. He said, and this was the part that stayed in her head long after the call ended, that he had connections at a surgical financing firm, that he could make a single phone call and have the entire balance restructured at a rate that would take the immediate pressure off entirely. Olivia did not say yes. She also did not say no. She said she would think about it, and then she sat in her kitchen for a long time after hanging up, staring at the wall. She did not tell Liam about the call that night. She told herself she needed time to think clearly before she brought it into any other conversation. That was true partially. The other part, the part she acknowledged only to herself in the quiet of her apartment, was that she already knew how Liam would react, not with anger, but with that particular stillness he had when something mattered to him, and he was choosing his words carefully. She didn't want to see his face while she admitted that she was considering it, because considering it meant she was tired. Tired of managing everything alone, tired of the weight that never fully lifted, tired of being the person who always found a way because there was no one else to find one. Derek called again 3 days later, and then again the following week. Each time the conversation was controlled and almost professional. He was not pressing her romantically, or at least he was careful not to appear to be. He was simply presenting a solution. He was making it easy. And Olivia, who had built her entire adult life on the principle of not needing anyone to make things easy for her, found herself listening longer each time. Liam saw them together for the first time on a Thursday afternoon in late January. He had been driving back from a job site when he spotted Olivia outside a coffee shop on Burnside, standing on the sidewalk in her work coat, talking to a man he didn't recognize at first. Then the man shifted his stance, and Liam recognized the jacket, the same dark, carefully tailored jacket from the night at Brood Grounds. He didn't stop. He kept driving both hands on the wheel, and told himself there was an explanation, and that he should ask her about it directly, and that he was not going to do what his instincts were currently suggesting, which was to assume the worst and retreat into the familiar safety of distance. He didn't ask that evening. He told himself he was waiting for the right moment. The right moment didn't come, partly because he didn't create it, and partly because she didn't offer one. The second time was about a week later, through the window of a restaurant near her store. He had been walking past with one of his contractors, glanced in by accident, and looked away quickly. He finished the conversation with his contractor on the sidewalk with his full professional attention, and then drove home and sat in his truck in his own driveway for 20 minutes without going inside. 2 sightings, no explanation, no conversation, because he hadn't asked, and she hadn't told him. And both of those facts were equally true and equally his fault, and hers. The distance between him and Olivia grew in the way that distances do when neither person addresses them directly, not with a single dramatic rupture, but with accumulation. He responded to her texts a little slower. She noticed and pulled back slightly in response. He told himself he was giving her space. She told herself she was not going to chase someone who was already retreating. Both of them were doing the thing they had always done, the thing they had been doing long before they met each other, protecting themselves from exactly the kind of loss they were already in the process of creating. Olivia met Derek one final time at a neutral location to hear the full details of what he was offering. She sat across from him in early February and listened to the specifics, the financing firm, the interest rate, the timeline. And she was aware the entire time that this was a transaction with terms she couldn't yet see. Derek was not a man who gave things away. She understood that. She also understood that her mother's surgery was scheduled for 6 weeks out, and that the down payment portion of the hospital bill was due in 30 days, and that the number was real, and the problem was real, and she was running out of clean solutions. She did not shake his hand. She said she would be in touch. She walked out onto the cold February street and stood there for a moment, with the wind coming down the block, and for the first time in years, she felt like she was standing at the edge of 2 versions of her life, one in which she handled this herself, cleanly, whatever it cost her, and one in which she accepted help from someone who had once publicly humiliated her in a room full of people, because he had calculated that she wasn't worth the trouble. What she didn't see, because she was facing the other direction, was Liam's truck parked at the far end of the block. He had been there when she arrived, had watched her walk into the restaurant, and then walk out. And he had seen her face on the sidewalk, the particular tightness of it, the way she was carrying something she hadn't shared with him. He drove away before she turned around. That night he sent her a short text. It said he needed some space to think. She read it in her kitchen, standing at the counter, still in her coat. She set the phone down carefully and did not respond, because there was nothing she could say that would not require her to explain everything she had been keeping back, and she was not ready to do that. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The thing they had been building quietly and without announcement for the past 3 months had not collapsed, but it had cracked cleanly and deeply along the exact fault lines they had each brought into it. From the beginning, his fear of loss, her fear of becoming someone else's burden. Neither of them had caused it alone. Both of them had let it happen. And in the silence between his text and her non-reply, the distance finished opening into something that looked from the outside like an ending. 3 days after Liam sent that text, Olivia called him. Not to explain, not to apologize. She called because her mother had been admitted to the hospital 2 weeks ahead of the scheduled surgery date, and she had just gotten off the phone with the cardiologist, and she was sitting in the hospital parking garage on the 2nd floor with the engine running and nowhere else to put what she was feeling. She didn't say any of that when he picked up. She just said his name. and then didn't say anything else, and the silence that followed was enough. Liam asked which hospital. She told him. He said he would be there in 20 minutes. He made it in 15. She was still in the parking garage when he arrived, standing beside her car, with her coat pulled tight and her eyes dry in the particular way that meant she had already used up whatever crying she had to do. He didn't rush at her with comfort. He walked over and stood beside her and looked at the concrete wall of the garage the same way she was looking at it, and they stood there together for a moment before she finally spoke. She told him everything. Not in order, not cleanly, but all of it. The calls from Derek, the meetings, the financing, offer, the 30-day deadline on the hospital, down payment, the way she had been sitting with all of it alone for weeks, because she had convinced herself that bringing it to Liam meant asking him to carry something that wasn't his. She said it quickly, and without performance, the way people confess things they've been holding too long, not for absolution, just for the relief of having it outside of her body at last. When she finished, she looked at him for the first time since he'd arrived. Liam was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You thought telling me would make you a burden. It wasn't a question." She looked away. "Didn't it, Olivia?" He waited until she looked back at him. "You know what a burden actually feels like. It feels like silence. It feels like 3 weeks of watching you disappear and not knowing why." He said it without accusation, without the tight edge of someone nursing a grievance. He said it the way a person states a fact they've had time to understand. "You not telling me was the hard part. Not any of the rest of it." She absorbed that. The parking garage hummed around them, a car somewhere on the level above the distant sound of the elevator, the low drone of fluorescent lighting. She had spent so many years building a life that required nothing from anyone else, had taken such careful pride in that self-sufficiency, that she had stopped being able to tell the difference between independence and isolation. She had called it strength. Standing here now, she wasn't entirely sure that was the right word for it. They went inside together. Margaret was stable. The early admission had been precautionary, a response to some irregular readings her cardiologist hadn't wanted to wait on. The surgery was now moved up to the following week. Olivia sat with her mother in the room, while Liam waited in the hall, and at some point, Margaret asked who had come with her, and Olivia told her. And her mother looked at her with the particular expression of a woman who had known her daughter for 34 years, and understood exactly what it meant that she hadn't come alone. Over the next several days, Liam did what he was good at, and this time he didn't stop at pointing toward the doors. He went through them himself. He contacted the hospital's patient financial services office, directly found the specific person with the authority to negotiate, rather than the general intake line, and spent the better part of 2 mornings on the phone working through the numbers. The difference between this and what he had offered in January was not the knowledge he had always known these channels existed, it was the permission. In January, it had been her problem to solve, and he had respected that. Now she had let him in, and that changed what help looked like. By the end of it, he had worked out a restructured payment arrangement that reduced the immediate down payment to something Olivia could manage without selling anything or accepting help from anyone she didn't trust. He presented it to her, not as a favor, but as a result, "Is what I found here, is how it works here, is what you need to do next." Olivia looked at the notes he had written out by hand on a yellow legal pad and felt something move through her that was too large and too complicated to name quickly. She had been prepared for most of her adult life for people to leave. She had not been prepared for this for someone who, after weeks of silence and distance and unspoken hurt, had shown up in a parking garage and then spent 3 days solving a problem because she had one. She called Derek that evening and told him she wouldn't be taking him up on his offer. He asked why, and she said because she didn't need it anymore, and because she didn't owe him an explanation beyond that. He started to say something about the mutual friend who had set up the blind date, about how Olivia was making things complicated, and she ended the call before he finished the sentence. She set the phone face down on the kitchen counter and did not pick it back up for an hour. When she did, there were no missed calls from him. There never were again. The surgery happened on a Thursday morning in late February. Olivia was at the hospital before 6, and Liam arrived an hour later with 2 coffees in a carrier and nothing that required a response. They sat in the surgical waiting room for 4 hours. They talked sometimes and were quiet other times, and the quiet was not the strained, loaded silence of 2 people managing unresolved things between them. It was the quieter kind, the kind that only exists between people who have stopped pretending they don't need each other. Margaret came through the surgery without complication. The surgeon used the word textbook, and Olivia closed her eyes for 3 full seconds when she heard it. That evening, after visiting hours ended, and they were back on the sidewalk outside the hospital, Liam finally said what he had been carrying since the parking garage. "I saw you with him twice," he said. "Once on Burnside, and once outside the restaurant near your store. Both times I drove away without asking you about it, because I told myself I was giving you space. But the truth is, I was just scared." He looked down the block, then back at her. "I've been scared since about the 3rd Tuesday morning we had coffee. I just got very good at not admitting it even to myself." Olivia looked at him steadily. "What were you scared of?" "The same thing you were," he said. "Needing something you might lose." She didn't argue with that. She had spent enough time in her own head over the past several weeks to know exactly what he meant, to recognize the mirror of it in her own choices, the withholding, the managing of distance, the careful rationing of honesty. They had both been doing it in their different ways, for their different reasons, and both of them had nearly let it cost them the only thing that had felt genuinely real in years. "I don't want to do that anymore," she said, not dramatically, just clearly. Liam looked at her for a long moment. The street was cold, and the hospital lights were yellow behind them, and somewhere nearby a bus pulled away from the curb and merged into the evening traffic. "Neither do I," he said. They did not kiss on that sidewalk. That is not where that moment lived. What happened was quieter and more permanent. They walked to their cars together, and at the point where the parking structure split into 2 directions, Liam stopped and asked if she wanted to get dinner. Not as a gesture, not as a signal, just as the next ordinary thing between 2 people who had decided to stop making their own lives harder. She said yes. They went to the Thai place on her block, the same one where she had told him about her mother's surgery in January, and they sat at the same corner table, and this time neither of them held anything back. What followed in the weeks after was not a dramatic transformation. It was something more honest than that, a gradual settling into a different way of being together, one that didn't require either of them to perform a version of themselves that had no needs, no fears, no history. Liam told her things he had not told anyone since Sarah died, not because he had been saving them for her specifically, but because she was the first person who created the kind of stillness in him where those things could surface without being forced. Olivia let him in on the parts of her life she had always kept categorically separate. From anyone she was close to the real financial picture, the ongoing management of her mother's recovery, the particular loneliness of being the person everyone else depended on, and having no one to depend on in return. They were not fixing each other. They were just finally being honest about what they'd each been carrying, and discovering that the carrying was lighter when it was shared. Margaret recovered steadily. By March, she was home. By April, she was back to calling Olivia twice a day, with opinions about things that did not require opinions, which Olivia had been told by the cardiologist was an excellent sign. Liam met Margaret on a Sunday afternoon in early April, when Olivia brought him to her mother's apartment for lunch. Margaret was a small woman, with sharp eyes, and the specific social confidence of someone who had lived long enough to stop softening her assessments. She looked Liam over for about 30 seconds when he walked in, then went back to the kitchen and told Olivia in a voice loud enough to be clearly intentional that he had a good face. Liam stood in the living room and said nothing, but the corner of his mouth moved in a way that Olivia noticed and filed away carefully. Spring came. The Irvington craftsman Liam had been renovating was finished in May, and the owners sent him a photograph of the front porch at dusk, the original wood trim restained, and the new windows set back into the original frames so that the house looked exactly like itself, only better. He forwarded the photo to Olivia with no comment, and she responded with 3 words, "You did that." He looked at his phone for a while after reading it. There was a Tuesday morning in June, one of the warmer ones, when Portland's perpetual gray finally gave way to something that felt like actual summer, when Liam arrived at the coffee shop before Olivia, as he always did, and ordered her coffee before she got there, as he always did. But this time, when she walked in and sat down across from him and reached for the cup, he looked at her and said he'd been thinking about something. She looked up at him. "Okay, I've been thinking," he said carefully, "about what it would look like to stop treating this like something that might disappear." He kept his voice even and his eyes on her. "To just decide it's real and act accordingly." Olivia set her cup down. Outside the window, the street was bright, and a couple walked past with a dog and a delivery truck, pulled up to the corner, and all of it was completely ordinary, completely ongoing the city, doing what it always did, regardless of what happened inside this particular room. She had spent a long time in her life making decisions based on what seemed survivable, rather than what seemed possible. She had been very good at it. She was tired of being good at it. "I think," she said, "that sounds like the most reasonable thing you've ever said to me." Liam smiled, not the careful, managed version she had seen in the early months, but the real one, the one that changed his whole face. She had been collecting those, cataloging them without meaning to, and this was the best one yet. They stayed at that table for 2 hours. When they finally left, they walked out together into the June morning, and the sidewalk was warm under their feet, and neither of them looked back at the door as it closed behind them. They didn't need to. Everything they were walking toward was already in front of them, ordinary and unhurried, and entirely solidly real. 1 year after a Friday night at Brood Grounds, Liam drove them back. He didn't tell her where they were going until they were parked outside, and then he just looked at her and waited to see what her face did. It did the thing he had hoped it would, recognition, then something softer. Then that particular steadiness she had that he had decided a long time ago was one of the most beautiful things he had ever seen in a person. They went inside. The host led them to a table near the window, and Liam had specifically requested it 3 days earlier, close enough to where it had all happened, that it didn't require explanation. They sat down. The room was full and warm and loud in the comfortable way of a place doing well on a Friday night, and for a moment, they just looked at each other across the table, the way they had that first night, except that everything was different now, and both of them knew it. Liam reached into his jacket pocket. He looked at her across the table and said quietly, "I have one question." Olivia watched him stand up from his chair and come around to her side of the table and go down on one knee, and the room did not go quiet. This time, it erupted table by table, as people noticed a wave of attention spreading outward from that one corner, and someone near the back actually started clapping, and within seconds the whole room had joined in. But Olivia barely heard any of it, because Liam was looking at her with the ring open in his hand, and saying the words she already knew were coming, the words that had started everything, the words that had turned an ordinary Friday night into the first page of something neither of them had dared to expect. "Would it be all right," he said, "if I sat here?" Her eyes filled. She laughed once short and surprised, and then she said, "Yes." She said it clearly, without hesitation, without the careful measuring of risk that had governed so much of her life for so long. Just yes. The room around them was loud and bright and full of strangers, who had all in this one moment become witnesses to something real. And Liam slid the ring onto her finger and stood up. and she stood with him. And when he held her, it was the kind of hold that doesn't announce itself, doesn't need to, the kind that simply says, "I'm not going anywhere." And neither finally was she.